Good afternoon, and welcome to Supply Chain Now Radio. We are broadcasting live today from sunny Port St. Joe, Florida. My name is Scott Luton. I'm your host for today's session. In our webinar today, we're going to be learning key insights and best practices on one of the hottest supply chain topics around the globe today, risk management. Our featured presenters today are Carlo Peters and Wesley Haaksma, both with the international consulting firm BCI Global. More about Carlo and Wesley in just a moment, but as always, we're glad to have you with us here today on Supply Chain Now Radio. So let's tackle our ground rules. All attendees will be on mute as we're looking to optimize the audio experience. Now, with that said, let's make it as interactive as possible. So please do submit your questions via the chat toolbar, and we'll answer as many of those as we have time for at the conclusion of today's webinar. And finally, a PDF of today's presentation and the recording will be sent out in the next few days to each of our registrants. So let's take a minute to recognize our sponsors here on Supply Chain Now Radio. Special thanks to our sponsor, TalentStream, a recruiting and staffing firm that specializes in helping organizations find top talent in the engineering, the manufacturing, and supply chain space. To learn more, visit us at talentstreamstaffing.com. And special thanks to our sponsor, APICS Atlanta, which has been serving the Metro Atlanta community since 1964. For those of you new to APICS, it is the premier industry association dedicated to end-to-end supply chain management. Around the world, our organization serves over 45,000 members. APICS offers membership and professional development, a wide range of education opportunities, industry-leading research and publications, and widely recognized professional certifications. To learn more, visit us at apicsatlanta.org. Okay, so we're in for a treat today. Let's share a little more information about our speakers. Carlo Peters has almost 30 years of experience in supply chain and logistics management, both from a supply side as well as from the demand side. For BCI, Carlo managed and carried out many projects in the area of supply chain management to include network optimization, transport optimization, including flow and procurement, transportation management, including the use of control towers, logistics procurement, outsourcing, and organizational alignment. Carlo has worked across many industry sectors and with clients such as Amazon, Electrolux, Abercrombie & Fitch, Caterpillar, Thermo Fisher, and Abbott, to name just a few. Before joining BCI, Carlo had different managing roles at various 3PLs in the areas of operations management, freight and warehousing, implementation, change management, and business development. So welcome, Carlo. Also want to introduce our second speaker today, Wesley Haaksma. Wesley has been part of the BCI organization for 5 years now. Wesley has experience in a wide range of supply chain related activities in multiple industry verticals. His main areas of expertise are supply chain strategy, supply chain network design, redesign, and optimization, supply chain risk management, and outsourcing and partner selection in industry verticals such as fast-moving consumer goods, healthcare, oil and gas, fashion, and logistics, to name just a few. Wesley was instrumental in enhancing the BCI proposition regarding supply chain risk management, where he developed a holistic approach which facilitates clear scenario comparisons from a risk, financial, and qualitative perspective. At BCI, Wesley has been working for clients such as ExxonMobil, SC Johnson, Mars, Stryker, Dyson, Boston Scientific, UPS, and many others. Please join me today in welcoming Carlo Peters and Wesley Haaksma.
Thank you, Scott. Thank you for the introduction. So let's now move on to the content of today's webinar. So this is Carlo Peters speaking now. Today's goals are, the majority of the companies that we are working for, they have some kind of risk management and risk mitigation strategies in place, which by itself, of course, is very good. However, what we also see is that many companies are lacking to include resilience in their supply chain setup. And resilience meaning the capacity and the speed to recover if something really goes wrong, despite any type of risk mitigation ideas and strategies. So what we would like to do here is we will share with you a few cases and examples of real-life practice. We really want to share with you why it is important to integrate resilience on top of risk management in supply chain strategy. And what we want to also share with you is the integrated approach to risk and resilience management and the framework that we have developed around it, and how it helps companies to be prepared for any kind of supply chain risk and how to deal with it if something goes wrong. We've prepared an agenda for today, a short introduction on BCI Global, why risk and resilience management. Then we want to explain the framework and the pros and the cons, and then we have a few cases that we want to illustrate. Finally, in the end, there will be hopefully there will be lots of questions, and as Scott mentioned before, we will take out as much as possible at the end to answer those questions. About BCI Global, so we are a company, a leading international consulting and implementation firm, established 33 years ago. And in the meantime, we've grown towards a company with global presence, with presence in the East and the West Coast in the US. Our US headquarters is based in Atlanta, whereas our overall headquarters is in Nijmegen in the Netherlands, and that's where we are originally based from. Furthermore, we have offices in Shanghai, in China, and Singapore, so that covers our Asia-Pacific businesses. And we're working through a partner in Sao Paulo for our Latin America business. And also Moscow, we have a partner, and all that together brings us together with approximately 200 supply chain professionals across the globe. So what is it that we do? So we are a company supporting other companies to expand their businesses and increase their value chain. With the, let's say, go-to-market strategies, how to go to the market if you know where the interesting markets are. And then we have, let's say, 3 pillars. One focusing on supply chain, so supply chain strategy development based on an overall strategy of the company. What should be the real deliverables of your supply chain in terms of speed to market, in terms of service that you want to bring to your customer. And then, let's say, in our supply chain consulting, we split it in 2 different pillars. On one hand, that's the infrastructure, to design the physical infrastructure of the supply chain, and looking at the network, where to locate your inventories, how to organize or how to optimize freight, transportation benchmarking, but also the strategic assessment whether you want to insource or outsource your operations. So that's more on the physical infrastructure. Then on the other hand, we're also supporting companies to optimize their planning processes. So really looking at demand, how does that translate towards inventory? How does it link to your manufacturing planning, and how does that link to your overall planning? So really the integrated business planning processes. And let's say through all of that, we are supporting customers to identify risks and identify resilience strategies. This in order to have not just the supply chain of your regular business, but also what can you do if something goes wrong. So that is on supply chain consulting. Then we are also focusing on manufacturing optimization, manufacturing consulting. There's on one hand the footprint optimization, which is kind of similar to network optimization within the supply chain. So where to locate your manufacturing sites, and of course that has completely significant drivers between manufacturing versus supply chain, but let's say from approach perspective, that's kind of similar. But also, how can you optimize the footprint within the 4 walls? Can you consolidate? Can you maybe move different product lines to other manufacturing sites? So that's really looking at footprint, manufacturing footprint optimization and site selection. And also there, of course, risk management and resilience management, that's key element in the total design of your manufacturing footprint. So all of that we do from a consultancy perspective, but we typically also tend to support our customers to really make something happening. So that's the implementation and change, either through bringing in a project management team or very specific engineering support, or change management, or in some cases just interim management because of lack of capacities of capabilities within an organization. We have interim managers that can support you. And of course also during implementation and change, the de-risking of an implementation project, that's also a key element of our services. So that's in a nutshell what we do. We are active in different market segments. You see a lot of logos here. All are, let's say, customers of BCI Global, and it's in different industry segments. So industrial manufacturing, the automotive industry. You see customers in the high tech, in the ICT and electronics. In fashion, lifestyle, industry, in food and beverage, and life sciences, being healthcare, both pharma as well as medtech. And not to forget, we are also supporting logistics service provider to optimize their strategies or to optimize their propositions into the markets. So that's enough on promo. Let's go to the real topic here. That's risk and resilience management. And why is this of importance? If you look to what's happening currently in the market or in the world, then you see a number of examples here. Tariffs recently introduced from the Americas on the imports of steel from Asia and from Europe, whereas immediately after that, also the EU announces tariffs against the US. That really, I would say the kickbox fight has now been unleashed, and tariffs are installed over and forth between US, Europe, as well as Asia. Another example, let's say related to risk in ports. The International Longshoremen Association, the ILA, they called for a shutdown of the US East and Gulf Coast ports and a day-long march on Washington, D.C. to protest against the loss of longshoring jobs and its effects on the economy. And I mean, the topic was about automation. Due to automation, there were job losses and the specific hiring practices in the ports. And in such case, even a one-day protest could lead to a various days of congestions at ports. So imagine what that could be as an effect on your supply chain if ports have a few days congestions or even more. Or another example, a recent fire in a UPS distribution center somewhere in Florida caused really major disruptions in the pick and pack operations of the UPS customer, and it was just at the winter season where the usual winter storms were coming up, and as a result, the plumbing and electric service customers, they have not received its usual deliveries, resulting in countless parts holdups for clients downstream, just at the moment that they really need the products. Or another recent example where Airbus issued its strongest warning yet over the Britain's departure from the European Union, saying that a withdrawal without a deal on future trade would force Airbus to reconsider its long-term position in the UK. Do they maybe need to replace their manufacturing from the UK somewhere to the continent of Europe? And who doesn't remember the Hanjin shipping bankruptcy early 2017? So most likely many of you here on the call, they may have had goods in the containers of Hanjin ships that were not or late delivered just before Thanksgiving and Christmas. Do you still remember the impact of your lost sales? Or one more example just to complete, an example of where DHL had a major problem with the startup and the implementation of a new distribution center in the UK for Kentucky Fried Chicken. And as a result, 900 KFC restaurants had to shut down due to lack of supply. So I think it's not really the question why risk and resilience management. It's more everybody knows that you need to do it and you need to have it. It's rather the question when, how, and where to put the money. So it's not do you need to have it. It's really how and when to organize it. And that is what this webinar is about. And we will guide you to an, let's say, efficient and effective process for risk and resilience management for this. So Wesley, the stage is yours here.
Thank you very much, Carlo. Let's say following Carlo's examples, what we typically do at BCI is we also ask companies what's going on in the industry. So therefore, I thought it would be interesting to share with you some results of the survey that we recently conducted. I won't share all the results, but at least some results that are key, perhaps for you as an audience. Well, as a short background, this is a survey which was held among supply chain executives across the globe, multiple geographies, in multiple industry verticals like healthcare, the industrial vertical, and fast-moving consumer goods. Well, what you see here on this slide is that the vast majority, let's say 80% of all survey participants, finds that supply chain risk management is of importance. Most of these executives also address this, because if we ask, do you typically have preventative measures to manage your supply chain risks, the vast majority of survey participants indicated that it is in fact the case. How do they then do that? They do that through a variety of supply chain risk assessment tools, and most likely a lot of the participants in this audience today has heard of these, like supply chain mapping, failure mode and effects analysis, but also simply the assessment of suppliers. Let's say risks are important. Let's say if we simply take some of the risks like natural disasters like Irma, or political turmoil like Brexit or the trade wars, that's not too strange that we find these kinds of results, but it's still good to learn that the vast majority of participants actually focuses on acting on these risks. Yes, another important aspect which we wanted to give away to the audience today is that when you actually make a concrete set of measures to manage risks, a lot of companies have business continuity plans. And let's say if you look at the business continuity plans, which are actually used in different type of sites in the supply chain, so in manufacturing, distribution, and actual in-market stock location, you can see that the vast majority of companies have, in fact, business continuity plans for their manufacturing sites, but to a much lesser extent for their in-market stock locations. For those of you that don't know, business continuity planning is basically, to say it simply, let's say a set of documents which companies can use to pick up after a disruption has occurred. So it's basically their contingency plan in case of a disruption like a natural disaster or an IT malfunction or whatever other possible disruption. What's usually in a business continuity plan is contact records, information about suppliers, and guidelines how to act in case of an emergency or a disruption. A last important element which we wanted to share in terms of the survey is related to the top countermeasures that companies typically tend to implement. So what you can see here on this slide is that most companies are using dual sourcing as a strategy to mitigate the impact of disruptions. So you can see several examples of dual sourcing, like implementing dual sourcing with your commodities by simply having multiple suppliers for your required supplies to manufacture your goods, to distribute your goods, but also in terms of logistics service providers. I know that many of the participants today to this webinar today are in fact VPs or of operations or supply chain. So many of you most likely know about, let's say, issues which occurred if there are issues with your logistics service providers. In addition, supplier relationship management is an important element here, as well as increasing production capacity. Let's say a major takeaway on this slide is that all of these measures show that companies are in fact looking for flexibility and redundancy, whether that is in having more suppliers for your commodities, LSPs, or having excess capacity in production or inventory. Basically, 90% of all these measures are linked to building in production, let's say, flexibility and redundancy in production and distribution. And that automatically, let's say, also links to the concept of resilience, which I'll explain in a minute. But before moving towards that concept, I would like, let's say, it's a little bit difficult in this setting, but I know for sure that many of you listening to this webinar are applying the traditional way to manage risks. Let's say many companies are applying the 2x2 matrix, failure mode and effect analysis. So basically coming up with let's say, a probability of occurrence and a potential, let's say, estimate of the impact, and then multiplying, prioritizing, and let's say determining an action plan. But let's say that's not a very good approach in the end, because most of these assessments, they are of limited quality. You typically don't have the right data to make the actual decisions. Companies make these decisions on an ad hoc basis, and it's also very difficult to estimate these different probabilities and the potential impact. So what BCI would like to share with you today in a couple of minutes is the approach that we have to properly manage risks. What we do is we typically add the concept of resilience to the risk approach. So what is basically resilience? Resilience is basically your ability as a company to come back to the original state after a disruption occurs. That can be, for instance, a disruption like Irma, like the hurricane which occurred a couple of months ago in Florida and in the Caribbean area, or any other disruption. So it's basically, let's say, what's basically important here is that companies applying resilience are not focusing on a sole, let's say, possible disruption, which is very hard to measure and very hard to measure the impact and the probability. But companies need to focus on improving their resilience capabilities of their supply chain as a whole. It doesn't make sense to focus on very specific things that can go wrong, because typically it's very hard to estimate how a certain disruption will ultimately unfold. So resilience is an approach which can help a company to increase, let's say, the resilience of a supply chain, regardless of the nature and origin of a disruption. So to give you an example, it could well be that some of you have heard of the company, but let's say the Food Performance Group in the Florida area is a major distributor in the US. And what they did after the horrific, let's say, disruption, Irma, the hurricane, which occurred last year, is what they did. they basically strengthened their supply chain without focusing on a very specific scenario. So Irma could have unfolded in many different ways. So what they did was they simply added additional generators. They used a very good transport routing system incorporating real-time information to improve their final distribution. They had additional stocking of their products in their 10 distribution centers located in the path of Irma to make sure that they could fulfill the demand after the hurricane passed. They also made sure that they have enough employees on site to get things going after the hurricane passed, because a lot of their employees of the food performance group, they were expected to leave, in knowing that the hurricane would actually arrive in hours. So my main message here is not to focus on a very strict scenario, but to increase resilience of your supply chain to make sure that it's less important to make, it's important not to focus on a very specific scenario, because you never know how it's going to unfold. It's better to increase your resilience in general. So to give you a short introduction about the BCI approach towards supply chain resilience. So on the top of this slide, you can basically see a process explained in 5 steps. And on the bottom of the slide, you can see both resilience competencies and risk sources. So what we typically do, to start with the visual on the top, is we tend to scope the project with the client, meaning determine the focus of the geographical scope, the business units in scope, and also make sure that we select the right risk sources and competencies which need to be investigated. Most likely, a lot of the persons, listening in to this webinar have different, different concerns, and we need to, in every project, we need to make sure that we address the right concerns. So after determining the right lists of risks and organizational competencies, we assess and prioritize these risks, after which we basically develop the measures required to address these risks. We make a right trade-off to make sure that we, that the balance between investing in risks and incurring costs is in fact the right one. Because most of you will understand that companies can invest a lot of means in supply chain risk management, but ultimately the goal of the company is to be profitable and to make sure that you make profit. So we need to, in every project we need to balance the cost and the investment with the potential gains and benefits. The entire model that BCI has developed encompasses 141 scoring factors, which we have categorized in a number of categories. So to pick out a couple of them, for instance, distribution flexibility is a competence which companies can implement before a disruption occurs. So the example which I've just given about Hurricane Irma and the food performance group is exactly that, distribution flexibility. Another one is, the procurement flexibility. That's basically the ability to do, for instance, dual source your commodities or your logistics capabilities. And risk sources, most likely those need less explanation. Obviously, you've heard about, let's say, geographical risks, about intentional attacks. Terrorism is hot on the agenda lately, unfortunately. And obviously, there are also pressures from the market, government, and civil society. Let's say we have the issue with Brexit at the moment. We have the trade wars going on. And also interdependence is an important factor here. So to give you a quick idea about how this then work, how does this then work in reality? So this is just a short example. We tend to make comparisons between scenarios, because that's typically what our clients are looking for. So in the first round, we typically scope what needs to be in scope. So in this case, management of inventory and LSP sourcing flexibility was a key element which needed to be investigated. We typically, based on statements and questions, we score the relevance and let's say the weakness or the strengths of an organization, and specifically in scenarios. We typically then tend to let's say evaluate those. We then typically tend to evaluate and prioritize these different factors using, in this case, for instance, spider graphs, to make sure that our clients understand and our audience understands where action is in fact required. And this is, by the way, used let's say around the world, because a lot of these elements are typically the same for most companies. A very important thing in managing risks is also determining the right mitigation strategy. And typically, it's also very hard to quantify those mitigation strategies and to compare that with the benefits which occur. So, first of all, a company, let's say, what we typically do is we try, together with our clients, we try to come up with the right mitigation strategy. So, for instance, to take an example here, a distribution of assets, that's on the second row. That's let's say how you can mitigate risks occurring from that. For instance, let's say if your distribution center, if there's a fire in your distribution center or in your manufacturing facility, then dispersed assets, that may sound very simple, but dispersed assets can help increase the resilience in your supply chain. How you can do that, let's say in the example of DCs, is by having, let's say, SKU stock keeping unit commonality in the distribution network. And the potential benefit could be that 30% of your demand can still be fulfilled after disruption, whereas in a worst case scenario, you would perhaps need to wait 5 to 10 days in the best case scenario to start your operations again. So what we typically do is we determine the cost of the risk in case of a disruption and compare that to a scenario where we typically do something about the risk or come up with a mitigation plan. So it's all about trying to quantify the different benefits and costs in terms of in terms of their impact and their cost, to make sure that you can make the right trade-off and the right apples-to-apples comparison in the scenarios. And it all comes together on this slide. This is basically an example of a supply chain risk analysis where we show multiple scenarios, and we show both the cost, the operating cost of a supply chain, as well as the required costs of different scenarios to effectively manage the risk. So let's say on the top left, you can see that in the SS scenario, you have, in this example at least, a DC in Germany and in Poland, in Europe, and the costs are 90 million euros operating costs. This is a fictional case. If you move towards a central distribution network with a DC in Belgium or a DC in the Czech Republic, costs tend to go down or up, and there's also an impact on the recurring costs. So our advice as a company is always to both take into account the cost of the operating cost of the supply chain, determining the qualitative factors of the supply chain, and determine the risk factors, and to make sure that that there's let's say the right trade-off occurs when determining the right footprint, the right supply chain design. So determine the required investment and required cost, and integrate those with your supply chain operating costs to make sure that you have the right comparison in place, and to, let's say, facilitate fact-based decision making. What you can see on the right-hand side of the slide is that in the as-is scenario, there's also, let's say in general, that there's also a trade-off to be made between cost and customer value. Once you increase the spend in managing risks, there's a less likelihood that let's say a disruption has an impact on your business operations, which means that customer value will increase. So this is typically how we provide insight to our clients and to show how risk can influence, let's say, your supply chain and the potential impact. Okay, Carlo, would you like to yeah, this was all very theoretical. Could you perhaps give the audience a couple of examples of how we approach this in the past?
Sure. Thank you, Wesley, for the explanation of the model, the methodology, how it works. I would like to take you through two examples of real-life cases that we conducted for customers that we conducted over time. And two cases basically splitting, let's say, one in a complete new supply chain design. So you can use this methodology if you're designing something new, but you can also use this methodology in an existing setup and simply incorporating that in the existing setup. So I would like to take you to two cases here. This is an example of both cases are made anonymously, but I can at least explain about the context, what type of company it is, and then how they are operating. So this is a healthcare company. On one hand, they are manufacturing medical equipment as well as medical devices and consumables. And they have a historically grown network with 6 distribution centers, and all of them, they were outsourced in the past. It was almost like a country setup, and a few distribution centers, they had a regional role, but basically almost each country had its own setup. So they've asked us to review the network, and they asked us to review the network in terms of how many DCs would be optimal, how many distribution centers would be optimal, should we go to centralization, should we have more, should we have less, should we have different roles of the distribution centers. And when we were talking to them, we explained to them this is also the unique opportunity to also integrate risk and resilience management as part of such project. In the past, often such a project was done based on purely a cost analysis versus a service and qualitative analysis. But we integrated in the approach the risk and resilience methodology. So what we did is we reviewed the network first on a traditional way. We looked at what is the cost and the service. So we looked at many more scenarios than we depicted here. But two typical, or at least two relevant scenarios were a full centralization scenario where there was one central distribution center for all of Europe. And and a dual hub scenario. And as mentioned before, there are more examples here. And if you would run the project right now, taking into account what we do know about Brexit right now, most likely it's going to be different again. But at least, so we made a cost comparison. And then in this case, you can see that the centralized scenario was significantly cheaper than the as-is scenario. And the dual hub scenario was somewhere in between. Then we identified the risks, and with the methodology that Wesley just had explained. We also came to risk indexes. And based on those risks, we have then determined on one hand, the mitigation strategies, but also how to build in the competencies, to build in the resilience if something would go wrong. So what would be the additional investment in terms of the investments in risk mitigation strategies as well as resilience capabilities. And then finally, in the end, we came to an equal, let's say in the centralized scenario, there was the real need for additional investment, significantly additional investment to take those countermeasures and capabilities development. Whereas the dual hub scenario came to a break-even cost level as the 6DC scenario. And there were some other qualitative factors that made it more relevant to go to the dual hub scenario. So in this specific case, there were key measures taken on the supply chain setup. I just explained that. But on top of that, with that methodology, the risk and resilience methodology, we also recommended to take measures in the organization and the responsibilities in terms of, quickly check here. Yeah, in terms of capabilities to ship from one DC, not only to one single country, but also to multiple countries. In order to be able to use one DC really as a backup scenario for the other DC. So that was part of the processes. Finally, in the end, that resulted also in the IT changes that they needed to make. All of that, by the way, was taken into account when we calculated the cost for that. And there was also duplicated at least a part of the inventory, which was really duplicated in order to be able to have, if something would go wrong in the network, to have the inventories in the right place in order to ship to customers. So this was an example in the healthcare industry. One other example, case example, that was, let's say, assessing just the current network, so let's say the current supply chain setup. So there was not the need for, or at least that was not the initial question, to revisit and revise the total setup. But this was really applying the methodology on the current setup. This was a company, a large multinational, global acting. The scope of this was the EMEA region, Europe, Middle East, including Africa, but also Middle East. And a large multinational with multiple BUs. It really was an integral review of the company risk and the resilience profile. What we did here is we applied the full scope, all 141 factors that we have as a standard template in our methodology. And in some specific cases, we see that we are adding, but in this specific example, we applied the 141 factors. We scored, or jointly with the customer, we scored all the factors on a Likert scale and with cross-functional teams. So teams that were involved included finance, included supply chain, of course, included manufacturing, included purchasing, quality assurance, so all cross-functional teams, cross BUs, and with the Likert scale and with the scoring on the Likert scale, 1 being completely disagree, 5 being fully agree, and then a long list of factor scores. We added that into multiple workshops with them, and that dialogue that helped the company in this project to define really what is important, where are the key risks, which are the risks that are being identified, what are the risk mitigation strategies that are already in place or needed to be in place, but more specifically also what is the required capabilities that if still something goes wrong, that we can kind of return to the original state again. That's really building the resilience capabilities, the resilience competences. And that also, well, result in specific investments, but also the key measures here, they were on one hand on the harmonization of processes and information systems and documentations. So that was on one hand processes, and they were really harmonized among BUs. What also a perfect opportunity here is that the BUs were able to share the same DCs. So initially, all BUs, they were kind of individual setup with own networks and own DC setup, and with simply changing, with keeping the same network in place, but changing inventories, inventory look, the deployment of the inventories over different DCs. There was a kind of duplicate network created for all the individual BUs. So no need to invest in additional buildings, but simply using them in a different way. So what also was taken as a measurement was consolidation of the customer service organization. They had all kind of individual customer service organization across countries. Also here, the BUs acted kind of independently from each other. Partly this was consolidated into basically two customer service organizations in two locations in Europe, whereas they shared the same resources and still having redundant networks if something would go wrong in one customer service organization versus the other. Other important element there was the implementation, a real new role in this company, a global risk and resilience and compliance officer. Yes, they had compliance officer all over the place, but the new part of that role was the global risk and resilience role. And that was a role implemented on a global scale across BUs, so really a kind of supporting role for all the individual business units in Europe, but also in the Americas as well as in Asia. And another thing, well, looks maybe a bit trivial, but I find in the end very important as well, that they also implement a real policy for social media and communication in order to always be aligned if individual persons communicate about the company, that they always have the same message into the markets. Yeah, in this specific case, we really provided, let's say, the structured approach and the guidance to this company to assess the risks and to make the right conclusions, to take the right measures, and to develop the organizational competences and the capabilities in order to be able to be more resilient in operating. Yeah, like Wesley mentioned before, this is really based on a fact-based decision-making process. So it's not somebody shouting out, "Hey, we need to do this and this." No, this is really based on a fact-based decision-making process in order to be able to well, step one was mitigate risks, but absolutely more important here was to build in the capabilities to be resilient and have a resilient supply chain. So, a few key takeaways here. We are reaching the end of at least the part that we want to present, and then we still have, let's say, a few minutes time for Q&A. Yeah, so what we see happening is that the traditional risk management approach fails. That's a bit black and white, of course. It is always important to have risk management in place, but it is more than just risk management. You need to build up the capabilities to have a resilient supply chain and to be able that if something goes wrong that you haven't been expecting, that you're able to come back to the state where you want to be and that you still can serve your customers either in a very short notice of time or maybe even kind of immediately. So resilience is really required to withstand disruptions and come back to the service and the cost levels that you want to have. And for that, really a holistic approach that's needed, and yeah, that is the methodology that has been developed here in BCI, where Wesley gave a good demonstration how it looks like, and we've illustrated it with a few examples here. So that brings us kind of to the end of our presentation. I think I would like to hand over here to Scott again for the Q&A session.
Thanks, Carlo and Wesley. Good stuff there. So to our audience, I've got about 12:49 Eastern Time. We're going to take the next 10 minutes or so and pose a few questions to our presenters. Feel free to submit a question via the chat toolbar, but we have several questions already teed up for you both, Carlo and Wesley. So first question. So as we all know, supply chain risk management is not a new topic, but it has grown in importance and priority over the last, say, 10 to 15 years or so. It seems to me, at least. In your view, what is properly, who is properly managing risk out there? You know, what are some of the best in class organizations when it comes to risk management?
Shall I take that one, Carlo?
Wesley, please go ahead.
Okay. Thank you very much for the question. It's a good question. I would say that there are a couple of, let's say, American companies which are good at this. A good example, I would say, which I did not mention, is Cisco. Most likely all of the attendees know Cisco. And what Cisco is doing really good is that they are basically, on a structural basis, they are de-risking let's say, the key capabilities and suppliers. They are investing in business continuity planning, crisis management, product resiliency, supply chain resiliency. So they are not focusing on a sole disruption that could occur, and that they are not making very detailed plans if that occurs, but they're building in flexibility in their supply chain to make sure that they can mitigate the impact of a disruption regardless of the nature and origin of the disruption. So that's basically a key difference between risk and resilience. And in my opinion, Cisco is applying this pretty well. Let's say another interesting thing is about Cisco is that they actually have, let's say, around the clock, they have a backup plan whenever a supplier cannot deliver a key component. So every component, there's a backup plan in Cisco for every key component that they have. So that basically guarantees to a large extent, let's say, continuity in their supply chain. Yeah, that's I think one. Yeah, food performance was an. I'm not sure if you have heard of the issue that occurred with Hasbro a couple of years ago, but it was a widely known case. Hasbro, you all know that's the major American toy company, and let's say what they did well from a resilience point of view. They simply rerouted their ocean freight. They had a lot of inbound ocean freight coming in to the western part of the U.S., to the west coast, to the port of Long Beach from Asia. And that's at some point in time there were the port strikes and nothing was moving anymore. So what Hasbro did well, in my opinion, is that they rerouted their inbound ocean freight to the east coast of the U.S., and that they basically circumvented the west coast, and they did so a lot sooner than their major competitors. So by being flexible, they simply made sure that they were impacted to a lesser extent when the port disruptions occurred at the port of Long Beach. That was a case I believe occurred a couple of years ago. So that's basically the difference between risk and resilience. That these two companies do very, very well, in my opinion. I hope that answers the question, Scott.
Definitely. Thank you, Wesley. And while I'm not real familiar with Hasbro from a supply chain personnel standpoint, Supply Chain Now Radio was really enjoyed having Jack Allen with the Cisco team, one of their supply chain leaders on our podcast a few months back. So great company, both of them. So thank you for taking that question.
Sure.
Next question, Wesley and Carlo, comes from Allison. And she asked, what kind of functions are typically involved at customer side, on the customer side in risk management control?
You want to take that one?
Yeah, this is Carlo speaking. Well, often this depends on, let's say, the scope of the project, the scope of what is the project about? Is it supply chain? Is it manufacturing? But let's say typical roles that you want to have in such projects, of course, are the supply chain directors, VPs, or managers. Other functions will include manufacturing. It's certainly always finance, because they are always involved in terms of determining the cost for certain mitigation strategies or resilience costs or competences that you need to build. Processes are always part of risk and resilience management. So that also means that IT has an important role. And in many cases, you see this, the role of that is often given to, let's say, the lead is often given to a quality assurance department. And it's a question whether that's the right place. Could be, but well, finally in the end, somebody must have the end responsibility for risk and resilience management. And we see that often that somewhere in the finance department as an overall accountability role. But for conducting a project, that's the let's say the roles that you would like to have involved. In very small cases, we also see it sometimes just a supply chain role or just a logistics role. So it really depends from case to case and project to project.
Terrific. Great question. Thanks to Allison and Henry for asking. So we've got time for one more question, and let's talk about the bottom line. You know, so many initiatives and projects that of course is a big thing to measure in terms of impact. So when we're talking about supply chain risk management, could one of you address the types of bottom line savings that successful and effective risk management approach can drive?
Would you like to take
Yeah, please go ahead, Wesley.
This is Wesley speaking. That's a very difficult question to answer, Scott, to be honest. The truth is that risk management is not a sexy topic, and it costs a lot of money. But there are also certainly a lot of potential benefits for a company. Let's say research has shown, and also what we've seen with working from our clients, is that you can let's say increase your let's say get your revenue back in the right shape. You can perhaps avoid shareholder loss. Some research has shown that you can avoid 10% of shareholder loss. You can let's say another major benefit is that you can basically decrease the reaction time if you have the proper resilience measures in place. Let's say the reaction time to get back on track, you can realize let's say a benefit of 50 to maybe 90% of an improvement there. But what you need to get those benefits, you need to have a proper resilience assessment in place. You need to be able to see, let's say, the warning signals early. You need to use real-time analytics, artificial intelligence, and again, the right resilience management approach in place. You basically need a holistic model to make sure that you make the right trade-offs to quantify the benefits and the costs, and to know the right risk mitigating strategies. And if you do that well, then you can, let's say, get your revenue back on, let's say, in the right shape. You can avoid shareholder loss, and you can make sure that you decrease the required reaction time to get back on your feet. But this really depends case by case, and a more detailed and thorough business case is required to really give a solid answer to that question, Scott. So maybe that is good for a potential follow-up. I don't know. I hope the answer satisfies. Yeah.
Maybe to add very briefly to that, the case example, my first case example that I explained, what you saw there is that basically the costs were really on par with, let's say, the option that was recommended with the baseline. So instead of adding costs, you were able to build a better network, better prepared against risks, with the right capabilities with a resilient supply chain at the same cost. So if you combine it with something redesigning of your supply chain setup, you can do it either on par or maybe even with an additional saving, but then still having a better and safe network.
Perfect. Thank you all for taking questions. Great presentation today. To our audience, I'm sure Carlo and Wesley would welcome the opportunity to compare notes and take your questions. We'll be providing their contact information in a follow-up information. I'll go out post-webinar in the next day or two. You can also learn more about BCI Global at bciglobal.com. So again, Carlo and Wesley, thank you for your time and perspective today. We're going to be concluding our session this afternoon on a few final items. First, we want to invite our audience to join us for one of our upcoming webinars. We've got several intriguing sessions on the docket focused on topics such as the gender pay gap IQ, creating a culture that attracts top supply chain talent, warehouse industry workforce update, and much, much more. Learn more at apicsatlanta.org. Secondly, if you're in the state of Georgia and want to engage the next generation of supply chain practitioners, we welcome you to join us for our Supply Chain 101 initiative, where we're taking teams of volunteers into elementary schools to talk supply chain with 3rd, 4th, and 5th graders. So you can contact us for more information on that. Also, if you're interested in pursuing a supply chain management certification, be sure to check out our APICS Atlanta CSCP and CLTD boot camps that are coming up at Georgia Tech, which are scheduled for the week of July 23rd. Finally, on any of these items, feel free to reach out to me if there's anything we can do to serve as a resource for you and your organization. So Carlo and Wesley, right before we conclude today's session, any final thoughts on your end?
Yeah, sure. I think, what we've tried to express here is that, let's say, the traditional risk management and risk mitigation strategies, they are important to do. And yes, you need to do that. But even more important is to build in resilience in your supply chain, to build in resilience in order to be able to come back to the state and let's say, the service that you had before. And depending from your own business, you should do that very, very fast and very quick, or it can take maybe 1 or 2 days. But build in that resilience and build the competencies and the capabilities to get back on track again. And either you can do that on, let's say, on your own, or you use a methodology similar to the ones that presented by Wesley. But feel free to reach out to us if you feel the need for support to build up a resilient supply chain in the future. So feel free to contact us if you feel if you want support for that.
Thank you very much. As we wrap up today, we'd like to give a big thanks to our guest speakers, Carlo Peters and Wesley Haaksma with BCI Global for their presentation and their insight. We also want to give a big thanks to their colleague, Allison Turner, for her facilitation and support. Finally, big thanks again to our sponsors, APICS Atlanta and TalentStream. So big thank you to our audience for participating. On behalf of Supply Chain Now Radio, this is Scott Luton concluding today's episode. Have a wonderful week, and we hope to reconnect with you again real soon. Thanks, everyone.